The galaxy was in a state of great turmoil. An ancient alien empire, known as the Tyloth, had set its sights on expanding its dominion across the stars. Its vast armies of robotic drones and heavily armored ground forces swept through system after system, obliterating any resistance that stood in their path. For the small, peaceful alliance of unified planets, this turn of events was truly alarming. Their own ships, while advanced in their own right, were no match for the sheer firepower and overwhelming numbers of the Tyloth Armada. The Alliance's leaders found themselves in a desperate situation, unsure of how to defend their member worlds against this formidable foe. In the Alliance's central command center, located on the bustling capital planet of Arcadia, the atmosphere was tense and apprehensive. The Alliance president, a seasoned statesman named Marcus Everhart, paced back and forth, his brow furrowed with worry. "This is a grave situation, my friends," Everhart said, addressing the assembled council members. "The Tyloth are relentless in their advance, and our forces are simply unable to match their firepower and numbers. We must find a solution, and quickly, before more of our worlds fall under their control." The council members exchanged worried glances, for they too recognized the dire nature of their predicament. One by one, they offered suggestions, each more desperate than the last, from fortifying their existing defenses to launching a preemptive strike against the Tyloth. But as they debated, it became increasingly clear that their options were severely limited. Suddenly, a young aide burst into the council chamber, his eyes wide with urgency. "Mr. President, we've received a distress call from the colony world of Tycaria," the aide announced breathlessly. "The Tyloth forces are closing in, and the colonial militia is outmatched. They're begging for our assistance." Everhart's expression hardened, his jaw set with determination. "Tycaria, that remote colony world on the edge of our territory. They've managed to avoid the Tyloth's attention thus far, but no longer." He turned to the council members, his voice resolute. "Gentlemen, we must act. Tycaria may be our last chance to turn the tide of this war." The council members exchanged troubled glances, their faces etched with uncertainty. They all knew the grim reality. The Alliance's forces were stretched thin, and they simply did not have the resources to mount an effective defense of Tycaria. "Mr. President," one of the councilors, a grizzled veteran named General Huldren, spoke up, "I must advise against committing our remaining forces to the defense of Tycaria. We barely have enough to hold our core worlds as it is. Sending troops to that colony would be a futile gesture, and we may lose even more in the process." Everhart's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "General, I understand your concern, but we cannot abandon Tycaria to its fate. If the Tyloth capture that world, it will only embolden them to push deeper into our territory. We must stand and fight, no matter the cost." The council chamber fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air. Everhart knew that he was asking his people to make a tremendous sacrifice, but in his heart, he believed it was the only way to turn the tide of this war. "There must be someone somewhere who can help us," Everhart pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. "We cannot allow the Tyloth to continue their rampage unchallenged." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of the situation settling upon them like a heavy cloak. They knew that their resources were dwindling, and that the fate of the entire alliance hung in the balance. As the minutes ticked by, the air in the council chamber grew thick with tension, and the future seemed more uncertain than ever. Deep within the alliance territories, on the remote colony world of Tycaria, a young man named Alex lived a relatively peaceful life, far removed from the turmoil that gripped the rest of the galaxy. Tycaria, with its lush landscapes and tranquil oceans, had managed to avoid the Tyloth's attention, thanks to its modest resources and isolated location. Growing up, Alex had heard countless tales of the legendary Deathworlders, a mysterious race of human-like beings from a planet with exceptionally harsh conditions. These Deathworlders were said to possess incredible strength, resilience, and combat prowess, able to single-handedly turn the tide of even the most ferocious battles. As a child, Alex had been captivated by these stories, his imagination running wild with visions of these awe-inspiring warriors. He had often wondered what it would be like to meet a genuine Deathworlder, to witness their remarkable abilities firsthand. Little did he know that his chance to do so would come sooner than he could have imagined. On the bustling streets of Ticaria's largest city, Alex frequented the local market, where traders from all corners of the galaxy would ply their wares. It was here that he had encountered a particularly gruff and imposing individual whose weathered features and steely-eyed gaze immediately marked him as someone not to be trifled with. The other traders whispered his name in hushed tones, Rykard, the Deathworlder trader. Alex had been both fascinated and intimidated by the man, drawn to his aura of barely contained power and intrigued by the stories that swirled around him. As the Psylof's conquest drew ever closer to Ticaria, the Alliance leaders made a desperate gamble. Recognizing the dire nature of their situation, they reached out to the colonial authorities, requesting that they locate and contact this Deathworlder trader, promising untold rewards if they could secure his aid in the war effort. The colonial administrators, their faces etched with worry, wasted no time in summoning Alex to their offices. They explained the gravity of the situation, the imminent threat posed by the Psyloth, and their belief that Rykard, the Deathworlder, could be the key to turning the tide of the war. Alex, the colonial governor said, his voice tinged with desperation, "You've had dealings with this Rykard before. We need you to convince him to join our fight against the Psyloth. The fate of our entire world, and perhaps the entire Alliance, rests on your shoulders." Alex, torn between his loyalty to the Alliance and his reluctance to involve the Deathworlder in such a perilous conflict, nodded solemnly. He knew that the future of Ticaria, and countless other worlds, hung in the balance. With a deep breath, he set out to find Rykard, determined to do whatever it took to secure his aid. As he made his way through the bustling market, Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The Psyloth's arrival was imminent, and the thought of facing their overwhelming might filled him with dread. But the stories of the Deathworlder's prowess had instilled in him a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, Rykard could be the salvation they so desperately needed. With a steadfast resolve, Alex approached the Deathworlder's stall, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the fate of his entire world now rested on his ability to convince this formidable stranger to join their cause. As the Psyloth's conquest drew ever closer to the remote colony world of Ticaria, the Alliance leaders found themselves in a desperate situation. With their own forces stretched thin and unable to mount an effective defense, they realized that their only hope lay in securing the aid of the legendary Deathworlder, Rykard. The colonial authorities in Ticaria had been tasked with locating and contacting Rykard, and they had wasted no time in summoning the young man, Alex, who had previously interacted with the Deathworlder at the local market. With a heavy heart, Alex made his way to the colonial government's headquarters, where he was ushered into a private meeting room. The colonial governor, a stern-faced man named Elias, greeted him with a grave expression. "Alex, we are facing a grave crisis," Elias began, his voice tense with urgency. "The Tyla forces are closing in, and our colonial militia is simply no match for their overwhelming firepower and numbers. We've reached out to the Alliance, but they are unable to send the reinforcements we so desperately need." The governor paused, his eyes locking with Alex. "That's why we've called you here. We understand that you've had dealings with the Deathworlder, Rykard, in the past. We need you to convince him to join our fight against the Psyloth. The fate of our world, and perhaps the entire Alliance, rests on his intervention." Alex felt a surge of apprehension wash over him. The thought of involving Rykard in such a perilous conflict made him deeply uneasy. The Deathworlder's reputation was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling, and Alex couldn't help but wonder if he was truly prepared to face the consequences of bringing such a formidable warrior into the fray. "Governor, I understand the gravity of the situation, But Rykard is a difficult and unpredictable individual. I'm not sure he will be willing to risk his life for our cause," Alex said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Elias nodded solemnly, his expression grim. "I understand your concerns, Alex, but we have little choice. The Tyloth are relentless, and our people will be slaughtered if we do not act. We are offering Rykard substantial rewards, as well as the promise of advanced technology and resources, if he agrees to aid us." The governor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Alex, you are our last hope. If you can't convince Rykard to join us, then I fear we are all doomed." Alex felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that the fate of his entire world, and perhaps the entire alliance, now rested on his shoulders. With a deep breath, he steeled his resolve and set out to find the Deathworlder, determined to do whatever it took to secure his aid. As Alex made his way through the bustling streets of Tykeria's largest city, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The Tyloth's arrival was imminent, and the thought of facing their overwhelming might filled him with dread. But the stories of Rykard's prowess had instilled in him a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Deathworlder could be the salvation they so desperately needed. With a steadfast determination, Alex approached Rykard's stall, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the future of his world, and the entire alliance, now rested on his ability to convince this formidable stranger to join their cause. As Alex approached Rykard's stall in the bustling market, he couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The Deathworlder's imposing presence and fearsome reputation had always filled him with a mixture of awe and unease, and now the fate of his entire world rested on his ability to convince this formidable stranger to join their fight against the Tyloth. Rykard, a gruff and weathered individual, stood behind his stall, expertly appraising the various wares the traders had brought for him to purchase. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, ever vigilant and alert, until they settled on Alex's approaching form. "Boy," Rykard growled, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder, "you have a look of purpose about you. What brings you to my stall on this day?" Alex swallowed hard, momentarily overcome by the Deathworlder's imposing presence, but he quickly regained his composure, remembering the gravity of the situation he had been tasked with. "Rykard," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected, "I come to you with a request, on behalf of the colonial authorities and the Alliance of Unified Planets." The Deathworlder's eyebrows rose slightly, a gesture that Alex interpreted as curiosity. Seizing the opportunity, he proceeded to explain the dire circumstances facing Tykeria and the Alliance as a whole. The relentless Tyloth invasion, the inability of their own forces to mount an effective defense, and the desperate need for someone of Rykard's legendary skills and prowess. As Alex spoke, Rykard listened intently, his sharp eyes never leaving the young man's face. When Alex had finished, the Deathworlder remained silent for a long, agonizing moment, contemplating the proposal. Finally, Rykard spoke, his deep voice tinged with a hint of amusement. "The Tyloth, you say? A formidable foe indeed. And what do you offer in return for my aid?" Alex felt his heart sink. He had known that convincing Rykard would not be an easy task, and the Deathworlder's response only confirmed his suspicions. "The Alliance has authorized us to offer you a substantial sum of credits, as well as the promise of advanced technology and resources," Alex replied, his voice laced with urgency. "They believe that your intervention could turn the tide of this war, and they are willing to reward you generously for your assistance." Rykard stroked his chin, his expression one of deep contemplation. Alex watched the Deathworlder's face intently, searching for any sign of agreement or acquiescence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Rykard spoke again. "Very well," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "I will lend my strength to your cause, but on one condition. I want full autonomy in my actions, and I will not be bound by your rules or regulations." Alex felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly tempered by a sense of unease. The Deathworlder's demand for complete freedom of action was troubling, and Alex couldn't help but wonder what it might entail. I will convey your terms to the colonial authorities and the Alliance," Alex stammered, his mind racing with the implications. "They will no doubt agree to your conditions, given the gravity of the situation." Rykard nodded, his expression unreadable. "See that they do," he said, his voice low and gruff. "For if they do not, I will withdraw my offer, and your world, and the Alliance will be doomed." With those words, Rykard turned and began to gather his wares, effectively dismissing Alex. The young man stood there, his mind whirling with a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that the fate of his world now rested in the hands of the enigmatic Deathworlder. With Rykard's agreement to aid the Alliance's efforts on Tycheria, the colonial authorities wasted no time in mobilizing their forces. Despite their limited resources and the overwhelming might of the Xyloth invaders, they were determined to make a stand and defend their home. As the enemy fleet approached the colony, the Deathworlder stood tall and imposing, his very presence exuding an aura of confidence and unbridled power. The Alliance soldiers, who had heard the tales of Rykard's legendary prowess, couldn't help but feel a surge of hope in the face of such an unstoppable ally. When the Tyloth ships finally opened fire, unleashing a barrage of devastating energy beams and projectiles, Rykard sprang into action. His movements were a blur, as the Deathworlder deftly evaded the incoming attacks, his agility and reflexes far surpassing anything that Xyloth forces had ever encountered. With a series of lightning-fast strikes, Rykard began to systematically disable the enemy's weaponry, crippling their ships one by one. The Xyloth commanders, stunned by the Deathworlder's sheer power and skill, struggled to adjust their tactics, but every attempt to counter Rykard's onslaught was met with utter failure. As the battle raged on in the skies above Tycheria, the ground forces of the Xyloth pressed their assault, their numbers and firepower seemingly overwhelming the colonial militia. But once again, Rykard proved himself to be a force to be reckoned with. Leaping from the Alliance's defensive emplacements, the Deathworlder charged headlong into the Xyloth ranks, his bare hands and sheer physical might proving to be more than a match for the enemy's advanced technology and weaponry. With each passing moment, the Xyloth soldiers found themselves increasingly bewildered and terrified, their resolve crumbling in the face of Rykard's unstoppable onslaught. The Alliance forces, emboldened by the Deathworlder's feats of valor, rallied and joined the fray, their once faltering morale now soaring to newfound heights. Together, they'd pushed back against the Xyloth invaders, slowly but surely gaining ground and reclaiming the colony's vital infrastructure. As the battle raged on, the reports of Rykard's exploits spread like wildfire through the Alliance's ranks, inspiring the beleaguered defenders and striking fear into the hearts of the Xyloth commanders. The once unstoppable alien juggernaut found itself on the defensive, its tactics and strategies proving woefully inadequate against the Deathworlder's raw power and unbridled fury. The Xyloth forces, recognizing the tide had turned against them, began to retreat, their retreat quickly descending into a full-blown rout as the Alliance and Rykard continued to press their advantage. The colonial skies, once darkened by the Xyloth armada, now echoed with the cheers and victorious cries of the embattled defenders. In the aftermath of the battle, the Alliance leaders and the colonial authorities gathered to assess the situation, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and awe. They had witnessed firsthand the incredible power of the Deathworlder, and they knew that without his timely intervention, Tycheria, and perhaps the entire Alliance, would have been lost. As the celebrations and victory parades commenced, the Alliance representatives approached Rykard, their expressions filled with gratitude and reverence. They offered the Deathworlder a place of honor and influence within their ranks, promising him unimaginable rewards and resources for his continued aid. But Rykard, his face unreadable, simply shook his head. "I am not one of you," he declared, his voice firm and unyielding, "and I have no desire to be part of your alliance. My path lies elsewhere." With those words, the Deathworlder turned and departed, leaving the Alliance to rebuild and forge a new future, one filled with the hope that Rykard's intervention had ignited. The news of Rykard's exploits during the battle for Tycheria spread like wildfire through the ranks of the Alliance forces. The tales of the Deathworlder's raw power and unparalleled combat prowess quickly became the stuff of legend, inspiring the beleaguered defenders and filling them with a renewed sense of hope. As the Alliance regrouped and assessed the damage from the Psylloth's assault, they knew that they had been given a rare and precious opportunity. The Psylloth forces, shaken by Rykard's intervention, had retreated, and the Alliance now had a chance to launch a decisive counterattack. In the Alliance's central command center, the mood was cautiously optimistic, but also tinged with a sense of urgency. They knew that the Psylloth would not be deterred for long, and that they had to act quickly to capitalize on this unexpected turn of events. "Gentlemen, the tide has turned," declared President Everhart, his voice ringing with determination. "The Deathworlder's actions have given us a chance to push back against the Psylloth, and we cannot afford to squander it." The assembled military leaders and strategic advisors nodded in agreement, their expressions grim but resolute. They knew that the stakes had never been higher, and that the fate of the entire Alliance hung in the balance. "We must coordinate a massive counteroffensive," said General Haldren, the seasoned military commander. "We'll need to mobilize every available asset, but with Rykard's aid, we just might have a chance of turning the tables on the Psylloth." The other council members exchanged thoughtful glances, their minds racing with the logistics and strategic implications of such a bold move. They had been on the defensive for so long, and the prospect of taking the fight to the Psylloth was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. "It's a risky gambit," cautioned one of the advisors, a brilliant but cautious tactician named Ileana. "The Psylloth are still a formidable foe, and we cannot afford to overextend ourselves. We must plan every step carefully and ensure that our forces are prepared for any eventuality." Everhart nodded, acknowledging the valid concerns. "You're right, Ileana. We cannot afford to be reckless, but we also cannot afford to let this opportunity slip through our fingers. The Psylloth must be stopped, and Rykard's presence has given us the chance we've been waiting for." With a renewed sense of purpose, the Alliance leaders began to formulate their counterattack, drawing upon the collective wisdom and resources of their member worlds. They knew that they were venturing into uncharted territory, but the prospect of victory and the chance to reclaim their freedom was too tantalizing to ignore. As the plans took shape, the Alliance forces began to mobilize, their morale bolstered by the tales of Rykard's heroic exploits. The once dejected soldiers and pilots now marched and flew with a renewed sense of determination, their eyes alight with the promise of a brighter future. The Psylloth, having weathered the unexpected onslaught on Tycheria, were caught off guard by the Alliance's sudden offensive. Their confident, relentless advance had been halted, and they now found themselves on the defensive, their superior numbers and firepower seemingly insufficient against the Alliance's newfound resolve. Rykard, his imposing presence at the forefront of the counterattack, continued to wreak havoc on the Psylloth forces, his sheer power and skill turning the tide of one battle after another. The enemy soldiers, once fearless and unstoppable, now fled in terror at the mere sight of the Deathworlder, their morale crumbling in the face of such an unstoppable foe. As the Alliance's victories mounted, the hope that had once been a mere glimmer began to blaze with the fire of 1,000 suns. The people of the Alliance, long resigned to the Psylloth's dominance, now looked to the future with renewed optimism, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had a chance to reclaim their freedom. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, the Alliance stood poised to turn the tide and push back against the Psylloth's relentless advance. And at the heart of it all was the enigmatic Deathworlder, Rykard, whose actions had ignited the spark of hope that now burned brightly in the hearts of the Alliance's defenders. As the Alliance's counteroffensive against the Psylloth forces continued to gain momentum, the once beleaguered defenders found themselves in an unfamiliar position. one of cautious optimism and growing confidence. The Tyloth, once thought to be an unstoppable juggernaut, had been forced onto the defensive, their superior numbers and firepower proving to be no match for the sheer power and skill of the Deathworlder, Rykard. In the aftermath of the latest decisive victory, Rykard stood apart from the jubilant celebrations, his weathered features betraying no outward emotion. The Alliance leaders and military commanders, their faces etched with gratitude and awe, approached the Deathworlder, eager to express their profound appreciation for his intervention. "Rykard," said President Everhart, his voice tinged with reverence, "words cannot begin to express our gratitude for what you have done. You have turned the tide of this war and have given us hope where we had none. We owe you a debt that can never be repaid." The Deathworlder regarded the Alliance leader with an impassive gaze, his arms folded across his broad chest. "Your war is won," he declared, his deep, rumbling voice cutting through the celebratory din. "I have upheld my end of the bargain. Now, it is time for me to depart." Everhart's expression shifted from one of elation to one of confusion and disappointment. "Depart," he echoed, his brow furrowing. "But Rykard, we have much more to accomplish together. We would be honored to have you join our ranks, to fight alongside us, and help us rebuild our shattered worlds." Rykard shook his head, his features betraying the slightest hint of impatience. "I am not one of you," he said, his words laced with a subtle finality. "And I have no desire to be part of your alliance. My path lies elsewhere." The Alliance representatives exchanged troubled glances, their excitement and elation rapidly giving way to confusion and disappointment. They had hoped that Rykard would agree to remain with them, to lend his formidable skills and experience to their ongoing efforts to reclaim their territories and restore peace to the galaxy. But the Deathworlder was steadfast in his decision, and no amount of pleading or bargaining could sway him. With a curt nod, Rykard turned and began to make his way through the throngs of cheering soldiers and civilians, his imposing figure swiftly disappearing into the distance. As the Alliance leaders watched Rykard's retreating form, a heavy silence settled over the crowd. The realization that their savior, the one who had single-handedly turned the tide of the war, was now leaving them to their own devices was a sobering one. Yet, despite the bittersweet nature of Rykard's departure, the Alliance found themselves filled with a renewed sense of hope and determination. The Deathworlder's actions had shown them that they were not as helpless as they had once believed, and that with the right kind of support and leadership, they could indeed stand up to the Tyloth's formidable might. As the celebrations resumed, the Alliance's focus shifted from the immediate threat of the Tyloth invasion to the long-term task of rebuilding and fortifying their defenses. They knew that the road ahead would be arduous, but they were now armed with the knowledge that they had the strength and resilience to overcome even the greatest of challenges. In the days and weeks that followed, the stories of Rykard's heroic exploits would be passed down from generation to generation, becoming a symbol of the Alliance's indomitable spirit and a testament to the power of determination and courage. And though the Deathworlder had departed, his legacy would continue to inspire the people of the Alliance, fueling their drive to forge a brighter, more secure future for all.